biodiversity destroying investments. But such an idea is completely out of bounds as far as the fossil fuel industry and its mascots in Congress are concerned. 100% of Republicans and one corporate Democrat in the Senate are bought and paid for by the same industry. The bottom line is their greed makes them short-sighted because apparently they care more about taking money from big oil than the future of the human race. And it blinds them to the fact, apparently, that catastrophic climate change will make the world uninhabitable, not just for our children and grandchildren, but for theirs as well. Corporate greed is also behind a list put together by Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, a professor of Yale University, that tracks American corporations and their activities in Russia. Since Sonnenfeld published his list, over 400 companies have withdrawn from Russia entirely, while dozens of others have completely suspended operations. That's the good news. There's a third category of companies that are scaling back, like Dunkin' Donuts, Johnson & Johnson, Hyatt, Marriott, Nestle, Kellogg, etc. But they need to be convinced to do better. The fourth category consists of 33 companies that have dug in their heels and refuse to stop investing in Russia's illegal war of aggression against the innocent Ukrainian people. You may not recognize the names of the companies, but you will recognize the products. Dixie cups and brawny paper towels made by Koch Industries, Bacardi, Reebok, Brooks Brothers, Nine West, Avon Cosmetics, and LG Appliances. The whole point of the sanctions being put in place by the Western Alliance, of course, is to bring the Russian economy to its knees. By staying in Russia, not only are these companies making money off of a war criminal and his corrupt regime, they're helping to perpetuate the war by propping up the Russian economy in order to line the pockets of their executives and their shareholders. Do not be fooled by those Republicans who've so belatedly become willing to support Ukraine, or by those corporations who still somehow need to be convinced that it's wrong to keep financing the Russian slaughter in Ukraine. These Republicans and their ally, Joe Manchin, these corporations, which are not people, as the Supreme Court would have us believe, but are indeed run by people, have so much fucking blood on their hands, even Lady Macbeth would be horrified. As usual, there is so much going on, but I literally can't think of anybody I would rather speak to right now than my next guest. He is a brilliant investigative journalist. He's won a Pulitzer Prize. He's written 4 New York Times bestselling books. I've read all of them. They're phenomenal. He's a co-founder of dsupreport.org. And he basically understands Donald Trump better than pretty much anybody else. I mean, I think he's one of the handful of people who really get the man who is Donald Trump. David Cay Johnston, it is such an honor to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me on, Mary. Those kind words.
Well, you know, they're well deserved. And I have a confession though. When I saw that your new book was coming out, it's called The Big Cheat. It was published, I believe, in November 2021. It is definitely a must read, so everybody go get it. I bought it, but I couldn't read it right away because I was afraid it was going to make my head explode. And guess what? When I finally did read it, it made my head explode. For those of you who don't know, and you should, David has written 3 essential Donald Trump books. The first in 2016 called The Making of Donald Trump. The second in 2018 called It's Even Worse Than You Think. And then The Big Cheat, as I just mentioned. So David, you have taken on the unenviable task of systematically laying out not just the crimes of one man, but the weak and corrupt systems that have allowed him to get away with these crimes. One, how have you managed to stay sane? And two, one of the things I really want to get into with you tonight is why don't more people get it?
Okay. Well, I certainly suffer severely from Trump fatigue. When Donald made his latest presidential announcement in 2015, I had a whole plan for the next 5 years of my life. I was finishing up a book, which I'm now finishing up, that proposes a whole new federal tax system that is simpler, cheat-proof. Every expert who's looked at it, including tax administrators, all say it would work. But as I watched Donald come down the escalator at Trump Tower and listen to, his lies, beginning with thousands of people are here, which isn't possible in the lobby of that building.
Yeah.
It suddenly hit me that Donald's run in 2012 had primed him for something devastating. In 2012, when he announced he was running, only two journalists, Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC and me in print, kept saying he's not running for president. He's running for a new contract with NBC. And nobody listened to us. I remember running into several prominent political journalists in green rooms and telling them that, and they go, okay, well, thank you. And politics reporters get paid to cover the horse race. They don't get paid to do policy or investigative reporting or anything like that. They get paid to cover the horse race.
Yeah.
And of course, he announced in 2012, well, I should be president. There's no one else who should be president, but right now my TV show needs me more. And the politics reporters had egg on their face. So I knew this time around they would do what they did. They dismissed him as a vanity project. And you may recall in the show The West Wing, the fictional president, Jed Bartlett, in one of the episodes says, I wasn't supposed to be president, but we were just in to push the issues. But, we began knocking off the other candidates one by one. And that's what Donald did.
Yeah.
So that day, I just said, and I talked to my wife about this at the time. I said, I know him. I understand him in a way I don't think any other journalist does. And I have a duty. I have to do this. It's not what I want to do, but I have to do this. And we also talked about, as he became president, dangers involved in this, from some wacko doing something. Those are the only people you really have to worry about. But I said on national TV, after Donald had described me as the journalist he hates most in the world, I said, if he can come up with an excuse to get me off the streets on some national security thing, he will.
Yep.
And we certainly agreed I was not going to set foot during his presidency in Russia or Saudi Arabia. I wouldn't fly in a Saudi airplane, because those would just be foolish things to do.
Right.
So.
Yeah, it has, and it's still scary. It's not that he lost his influenced way in the Republican Party, finally came to its senses, and decided to go in a completely different direction. He's as relevant. He all but declared his candidacy for 2024, which I'm sure sent a chill up your spine, as it did mine, if for no other reason than I'm really tired. Really tired of having to talk about this.
Yes, and he makes these unbelievably inane comments. His suggestion that we put Chinese insignia on American jets and bomb Moscow and then blame the Chinese. I mean, this is typical of Donald. That is like junior high school thinking. But in my view, Donald has lived not Groundhog Day, but Groundhog Nightmare. He has been trapped his whole life in that year we all went through of puberty. Mm-hmm. And he's been stuck in it emotionally his whole life. That's why he talks about women the way he does. It's the why he engages in these petty sort of junior high school behaviors. It was one of the first things that I recognized about him when I first met him 34 years ago, and immediately said, this guy's going to be important, and started building files on him the way I did on some other prominent Americans. Jack Welch at GE, Daryl Gates, the LA police chief, Barron Hilton, who ripped off starving children for 2/3 of $1 billion, or he was going to. He finally had to give it back at his death.
Yeah, he's in good company, is Donald. So you obviously you've written about many more things, but I do want to focus on sort of the way the myth of Donald has been and continues to be perpetuated, even though most of us paying attention understand just to what degree it's a myth. But also the sense that the walls are closing in. Are the walls closing in? You wrote a great piece, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe for the Daily Beast in February, about the fact that prosecutors were zeroing in. And you mentioned Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg and that case. But since then, it looks like, especially with the resignations of two very high profile prosecutors who were working on that case, that nothing may come of it. Does that concern you I mean, not just specifically to that case, but in general, given Donald's track record of, dancing between the raindrops?
Yeah. Donald has an amazing track record of slipping out of the hands of law enforcement. I mean, as my friend, the late, great Wayne Barrett, reported long ago, decades ago, in his 30s, Donald escaped 4 federal grand juries. The piece was in the New York Daily News, by the way.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And that's okay. That's where it is. It's readily available if people want to read it. And it's called Donald's Turn in the Dock. And a couple days after that, it came out that the 2 top prosecutors for the Manhattan District Attorney resigned as a matter of principle. Alvin Bragg, the newly elected district attorney, evidently from subsequent reporting in the New York Times by very, very good reporters, said he didn't think they had the case to make a conviction. It's very important to understand what they were investigating. Donald claims to be the world's greatest expert of all time on taxes. Mm-hmm. I'm a worldwide recognized expert on taxes. I've lectured on taxes on every continent but Antarctica. And I have this, proposed new federal tax system. Donald doesn't know anything about taxes. So despite that, if you brought a tax charge against him, his lawyers would simply say, Donald Trump was simply puffing. He was, puffing up his image. He just did what the accountants and the lawyers told him to do. Well, I know that's not true because Donald has had 2 trials for tax fraud, but they were civil, not criminal. I was the one who broke that story. And in one of those trials, his decades-long tax lawyer and accountant, Jack Mitnick, testified that Donald had forged the tax return that was filed with the government. It wasn't the one Jack Mitnick prepared, but it had Jack Mitnick's signature put on.
Yeah, Jack Mitnick was my accountant too, so I'm very familiar.
That's right. Now, he did the whole family, right? And with a photocopy machine, Donald put his signature on it. And the reason I was particularly attuned to this was the second big investigation early in my career, when I was in my early 20s, was of a corrupt Michigan legislator, a state senator, who used a photocopy machine to put his name on his predecessor in the legislature's widow's records. Told the state Supreme Court he was going to die within weeks from, to this day, always fatal form of cancer. And by motion of the court, after he miserably failed the bar exam, they made him a lawyer. He suddenly miraculously was cured, and he used that law license to cheat the widow out of her multi-million-dollar fortune, among many other misdeeds. But the message never got out to the public in any meaningful way. I wrote it in the Daily Beast. That was something I did write for the Daily Beast. I told all sorts of nationally known journalists who I know about this. Nobody went after it. Nobody raised it because politics reporters don't cover those things. They just cover the horse race.
Right.
And in the case of the Manhattan grand jury, which is not the only case facing Donald,
right,
it appears that the prosecutors got off onto the issue of his inflating assets to banks.
Right.
If the banks didn't suffer any harm in the time period he's describing, that's not a case you're going to win. But inflating assets to the banks relates to, did you understate those same assets for property taxes and get a benefit there? Did you play with the asset values when you made either insurance claims or when you paid premiums on your properties? And I thought quite clearly they were bringing what's called an Article 460 case. That's the New York State racketeering statute. And let me just digress to say, I'm not a lawyer, but I've been a professor of law now for 13 years at Syracuse University's College of Law. And the New York Times reporting makes it pretty clear they were just narrowly focused on this one area. Now, there's also some question about Alvin Bragg and his friends and why he isn't pursuing this. But even the collapse of that case doesn't clear Donald. Mimi Rocha, the former career prosecutor for the federal government in Manhattan.
Yeah, she's amazing, and that's where I was going with this, so thank you.
She's now the elected DA in Westchester County. She's pursuing a case involving, among other things, Donald claiming, as Brian Ross and I reported separately a long time ago, and a guy at the local daily paper, that his golf course in Westchester is only worth $1.3 million. His federal forms say $50 million. He has repeatedly said in public more than 100. Well, the house I'm sitting in right now, I challenged the property tax assessment on it, but the difference was $30,000.
Right.
It was a 10% range in the value of the house, roughly. 1.3 million, 50 million, 100 million, that's a badge of fraud.
Yeah.
He's under civil investigation by the Attorney General of New York, Letitia James. She will be pursuing her case. She's made that very clear. She actually can criminally prosecute him if Governor Hochul gives her criminal authority. If Alvin Bragg says, I need to be out of this case, she acquires criminal authority. And I think there ought to be a lot of discussion about why isn't Kathy Hochul giving criminal authority to Letitia James, even forcing it on her if she would rather do a civil case. Then he's under criminal investigation with a single-purpose grand jury in Fulton County, Georgia, right, which basically overlays Atlanta. Fannie Willis is the elected DA there. There's been talk among Republicans in the Georgia legislature of passing a special law to prevent that case, which would be an outrage by any standard. And then he's got a serious civil investigation by Carl Racine, the Attorney General of Washington, D.C. They raised $107 million of charitable funds for the inaugural. Barack Obama raised less than half that. Right. He had 8 balls and an A-list of all sorts of entertainers. And you have to pay to bring these people in. The musicians themselves typically get paid, not the headliner. And a much bigger affair. And they couldn't even spend $53 million. And right, I report in The Big Cheat how Melania Trump's former best friend, then best friend, Stephanie Wolkoff, is asked by Rick Gates, convicted felon, deputy to Paul Manafort, about taking money off the books. And it was so stunning to her that they asked this after she'd already made it clear she was a straight arrow,
right,
that she was taken aback for a second. And then she said, I'm not going to do that. She knows she's not going to commit a crime, but that they would be so brazen as to do that. So Donald is not out of the woods.
Right.
In addition to that, the January 6th committee is clearly coming up with extensive evidence that I think a lot of people will turn off to, but that will clearly document that January 6th was an attempted coup by Donald Trump. He just was incompetent. He didn't know how to pull it off. But John Eastman, who I debated once, and in the words of one of the students, wiped the floor with him. He's a law school dean. I'm a mere lecturer in the law, and he had lots of ideology, didn't have lots of understanding and facts.
Right.
He could still be gone after for that. I think the Attorney General Merrick Garland is really hoping a state or local government will pursue this. But, if not, it's his duty to step up to the plate. Right. And I'm a big believer in the concept of duty and honor.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't see very many people in the Republican Party who care about either one of those things. Donald certainly doesn't, and
Doesn't even know what it means.
no, he doesn't. And I, in a way, I mean, I don't want to let him off the hook for anything, but party leadership certainly took advantage of that.
Oh,
And
yeah.
right,
One thing, Mary, you notice the party is paying legal bills for Donald and his son Don Jr. for matters that are pre his becoming president. Why would they do that? Why would they take donors' money to do that? Well, I think the answer to that is obvious. They're terrified that he will run as a third-party candidate, which would guarantee a Democrat. They could run anybody, and they would win the White House.
Yeah.
I don't know if he'll do that or not, because when he gets indicted, when he gets wrapped up in litigation, active litigation, which will hound him till the day he dies, I suspect, unless he lives to be 100, might happen in how long his parents lived.
Yeah, we're a quite long-lived bunch, generally speaking.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, I want to get back because I think that is important. They're paying tributes to him essentially. It's all very authoritarian, but I want to get back for a second to a couple of things you said. And a quick aside, in your talking about the inauguration fund and the shenanigans and the law breaking that went on. I want people to understand that one of the things you do so well is take people through an event like that step by step, build the evidence. It's so compelling.
Yeah.
And again, that's one of dozens of instances of criminality.
Well, one of the things in the 3 Donald books, everything is tied to a public record, a court document, a letter he wrote, except for Donald's and my one-on-one conversations, all of which I wrote about at the time. And my reporting is, I went back and checked, made sure what I wrote in the books is consistent with what I reported at the time. There's no unnamed sources because there's so much about Donald. There's no need to do that.
Exactly.
Provided you understand the relevant laws or can learn them, and you understand the context of them to other events.
Yeah. And that's really important. Unfortunately, I think people who need to be convinced aren't necessarily reading your books or listening to this podcast because they don't want to know. The other problem, though, and this is something that is extraordinarily frustrating to me as somebody who's known him my whole life and as somebody who grew up in New York, and I'm sure to you, as it was to Wayne Barrett, who have been keeping track of his business dealings for so long. Why is it so hard to get people to understand just how wrong everything they think they know about him is, and 2, to get indictments with real teeth? Like, why is Alvin Bragg not going through with it? Why, and empowering his prosecutors? Why is the governor not granting that power to Letitia James, who really does seem to want to take this to its logical conclusion? And what is going on with Merrick Garland? I mean, it's all so frustrating.
Well, let me go back to Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, written at the dawn of the 20th century. It was about the meatpacking industry and the mistreatment of the workers and how many of them died unnecessarily. And we got from that the second Federal Meat Act. There had been one earlier. And Upton Sinclair said, "I shot an arrow at America's heart and hit its stomach." People were worried about themselves and whether their food was safe. They weren't worried about the workers, their fellow citizens.
Right.
Donald has fertile ground for what he's trying to do as a would-be dictator. 90% of Americans had a smaller income, adjusted for inflation, but had a smaller income in 2018 than in 1973. Basically, in 2018, they only got 50 weeks pay, and then they went 2 weeks with no pay. At the same time, in 1973, healthcare was not particularly expensive. Right. And most employers provided it entirely on top of your wages. Of course, today, most employers take a big chunk of your wages for the healthcare. For every dollar people added in equity in their homes during those 40 some years, they took on $2 of debt. That's not a prescription for prosperity. That is a prescription for being on the hamster wheel forever.
Yeah.
And of course, pensions pretty much gone for most
Yep.
people. And many of them that are still around are systematically being looted while the government says, oh, no, that's perfectly legal what you're doing by selling the pension plan to an insurance company. And you lose your federal guarantee of your income. And Donald is appealing to people who they're angry legitimately. Why am I worse off than dad and mom and grandma and grandpa? I went to work every day. I did everything I'm supposed to do. Why am I in all this debt? Why do I have no savings? Why am I living paycheck to paycheck? That's one part of it. And it totally applies to the bottom 50% and to many people in the bottom 90. And then we have had this veneer of progress over the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and the religious tolerance movements that arose after World War II. And Donald just ripped it off.
Right.
And exposed that the country is full of people who want to be able to use racial slurs, religious slurs, who want to tell women, your place is to sit down, shut up, and do whatever your husband says to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a toxic mix of things. But as with Upton Sinclair, this is about their emotions. It's not about reason. And we specifically don't teach critical thinking skills in school. People who go to college, who go to law school, who go to philosophy degrees, they learn critical thinking skills. Journalists learn them. But most Americans, there's no teaching of it. In fact, if you try to engage in high school, as I did, on a critical level with some teachers, you'll find yourself in the office just for being difficult or contradicting presenting, here's a book that says what you're telling us, teacher, isn't true.
Yeah.
Or at least questionable. And so he appeals to people on a gut level. And it's very hard to change that sort of attitude, Mary. Very hard.
It is. You mentioned that we don't teach critical thinking, although apparently people are easily convinced that we teach critical race theory, which we don't in K through 12 schools.
Yes, I would love explaining to a third grader how the design of a statute that appears to be race neutral actually disadvantages Black people. I mean, I can do that for you, but
yeah,
a third grader would go, huh?
You just say, wait till you get to law school, kid. That's what I would have to say.
Right.
So, yeah, I've always said that Donald didn't change the Republican Party. He revealed it for what it was. Yes. But I have to confess to being surprised that there are so many people who fell for what he was selling. And again, it was 62 million in 2016. It was 74 million, which was a devastating thing to have to grapple with in 2020. So I don't necessarily think that he's done anything new except give people permission not to have to feel bad about it.
Right. No, I exactly agree with you about that. I mean, in my view, Donald is the greatest con artist who ever lived. He conned his way into the White House, the most powerful position in the world. And the key to being a successful con artist, and I've written about lots of them before I met Donald, is you persuade people to believe something that isn't so. And one of the things we know about con artists is there are many cases of this. Housewife loses all her money to a Nigerian prince scam, or a husband blows all the money on some fictitious investment where he gets cleaned out. And often people will hide this from their spouse. They're so ashamed and embarrassed. The leading leader of the anti-tax protest movement, Irwin Schiff, was a tax shelter salesman in Connecticut. He sold insurance, but it was basically tax shelter products. Mm-hmm. And a con artist ripped him off, and he spent the rest of his life writing books and denouncing the government. And we know that, in fact, that wasn't the reason, because he put his psychiatrist's notes into the public record. And the psychiatrist said, he couldn't admit that he had been, and all his clients had been stripped bare by a con artist. And if you're a solid Trumper, to say, oh my goodness, the man doesn't know anything. He has put our national security in danger repeatedly. He has given away the most sensitive intelligence secrets to the Russians, all of which are thoroughly documented. You would then have to say of yourself, I'm a fool. And that's
Right.
really hard, really hard. People can do it, but something's got to happen that's really dangerous. Instead, what people do is they double down.
Yeah.
And my business, news, we compound this by the way we write things.
Mhm.
So we'll quote Donald and then take it apart. No, the right way to do it is you tell people, we're about to tell you something that Donald said that is provably not true. Now your mind is set up to be skeptical. Then
Yes.
you tell, then you take it apart. And there's research by cognitive scientists, by like George Lakoff at the University of California, showing this, that the way you present it, this is not unlike many other things. I mean, if you walk up to somebody who they don't know their spouse has died, I've been in that position as a reporter, their spouse or their child, you walk up and say, hey, Mary, your husband's dead. You know, you will psychologically suffer from that for the rest of your life. Instead,
That's right.
you say, you know, Mary, there's something, you know, you need to know, and you just slowly let it come upon themselves, and then you confirm it to them. That's the kind way to do it.
Right.
And so in my business, we compound this by the way we do it.
I completely agree. And, you know, it is a measurable psychological phenomenon that people just, in layperson's terms, people hate being wrong. And, you know, they don't want to point it out. And they do, of course, it hurts. It's humiliating, you know, just like it's weirdly, because this also, I think, compounds it. It's humiliating to recognize that you've been fooled by another person, even though it shouldn't be, because you were harmed, right? You shouldn't be humiliated, but people are. So we have both of those things going on, because these people who support Donald have been lied to so much by so many different people that I think it makes their ability to grasp what's actually happening now and what's happened to them almost impossible.
Well, he benefits, Mary, from one more aspect of this, which is that once he sets the narrative and it's simple, it's easy to glom onto that. So Hillary Clinton comes along with, and I thought, you know, she'll be an okay president. Her primary, if she becomes president, her focus will be on two things. She's going to make Vladimir Putin pay dearly for taking Crimea, and she's going to be the children's president. We're going to see the whole federal government focus on the development of children and the future.
How terrible would that have been?
Yeah, what a horrible idea. She, I'm being facetious.
We're both being very sarcastic.
Yes,
about that.
but as you know, Donald has these big ups and downs in his moods, and he's fundamentally lazy. I mean, he makes Ronald Reagan look like a hardworking guy. So during the 2016 campaign, he disappears for days at a time. He's only seen or out in public when he calls Fox or some radio show on the telephone, but he's holed up in Trump Tower. Hillary Clinton was out there every day to the point where she literally wore herself to exhaustion, and he keeps calling her lazy.
Right.
And Donald projects. If he says Hillary Clinton's lazy, he's really telling us he's lazy. She has no stamina. No, he's the guy with no stamina. And by doing that, there was no response to that. So he comes across as this champion of the forgotten man and woman, and I alone can solve your problems, the hero figure from Dune, the movie.
Yeah.
And Hillary Clinton, to her own fault, comes across as blah, 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 blah. Oh, and blah, blah, blah. And I have another 21-point plan here. And let me tell you more, blah, blah, blah. And that's just a great environment for him, because he can just give out simple nostrums, and he tests them. And many of his nostrums, by the way, came right from me, word for word, things that were economic policies that I recommended. He put a twist on them, but they came right from my work. He didn't read my economics books, but he saw me on TV. And I know, because of intermediaries who called me, they'd say, Donald's talking about X, Y, Z. What is this about? He said, you said. He was testing those things out. So I, by the way, bear some responsibility for his success in getting at people.
Well, I think we can let you off the hook for that. There are plenty of people much more responsible for what happened. And I mean, I would disagree slightly. I think Hillary Clinton maybe gave people too much credit and actually thought people cared. She would give brilliant policy speeches, and and again, getting back to this issue of how people are primed by media, mainstream media. She would be giving brilliant policy speeches and they wouldn't be covered because there would be a camera on an empty podium waiting for Donald.
I agree with that. There's no question that television was completely enamored of Donald because literally their research showed the minute they turned away, people switched to, watching Law and Order or horrible shows, Bachelor and Bachelorette,
right,
that denigrate marriage.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think there's anything we can do about this now. I think that die has been cast. Those die have been cast. And going forward, whoever runs on the Democratic side needs to figure that out, right? Needs to figure out how to get the message across without complexity, which is very sad. Until a couple of generations from now, when children have been taught critical thinking and media literacy and all that stuff. But part of what the problem now that I see is the way things are framed, as you mentioned, because it's not simply by not setting up the analysis properly, like by not saying, okay, this is an absolutely untrue statement. This is what he said. And then this is why it's untrue. They're also asking questions that legitimize things that should not be able to be legitimized. Instead of saying, why is he being allowed? Why should he ever be allowed to run again? The question is he going to run? Which legitimizes his ability to. Is that right? Do you see it that way as well?
I think you're right about that. And I have for years written that the Democrats, and I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, okay? I was a registered Republican for many years just because where I live in Western New York, the primaries are more interesting in that party.
Right. Yes.
The Democrats don't know how to market.
Right.
The Republicans have phrases, the death tax. There is no death tax in America, but that sticks with people. They know how to create meaningful slogans and to stick to them. So I run a national news service now that I'm retired from the New York Times called DC Report. In fact, we started it because of Donald winning the Electoral College after he lost the popular vote. And we cover what politicians do, not just what they say. And I did a piece a month or two ago, or actually probably last fall, about how Biden keeps saying, we're going to spend $3.5 trillion to build back better. And my column was, are you nuts? What you want to be telling the public is that for an investment of less than $3 per day, less than the average cup of coffee in a restaurant, we can have a society that will be wealthier, healthier, far less risk if you get sick, that your family will end up in poverty when you're old. Would you invest $3 a day to have a better future for your children? Well, son of a gun, Biden walks out on a stage and he says, this is a plan to invest in the future of America. It lasted one news cycle and he went right back to, we want to spend $3.5 trillion. The Democrats seem to have learned helplessness, a phrase I know that you understand, to have learned helplessness when it comes to marketing.
Yeah. I agree with that. And that is demoralizing. Because so much is at stake here. And I guess one of the reasons it's demoralizing is because the Republicans have been so adept at using cynicism.
Yes.
And apparently cynicism, if you'll forgive the phrase, trumps hope.
Well, if you're in the 90% who your life is not better than your parents or your grandparents, it's not unreasonable that your view of the world is, I will never get ahead.
Right.
The better answer to that is, well, and this is what my economics trilogy is about, is people don't have any idea of how they are creating, through little known government policies, this enormous wealth at the top. And I'll give you one good simple example of this. In 20 states, politically connected companies, that is, companies in favor with the then governor, have made deals that they keep the state income taxes withheld from their workers' paychecks. By the way, Rupert Murdoch's Fox News is one of the biggest beneficiaries of this. So the state income taxes get withheld. They never go to the government. And GE, for example, wanted to refurbish its aviation plant. They build jet engines and related equipment in Ohio. 92% of the cost of that investment came from the workers. The expected annual return on the investment was around 14%, which means 6 months after the plant opened up, they had recouped their investment. From there on out, their rate of return was infinite. Every dollar of profit was against no investment. What a fantastic position to be in. And things like this all over the country, in a whole industry that collects, you are forced to pay prices to them because they're monopolies that include not just their corporate income tax, but what's called the grossed up corporate income tax, which is the taxes on the money to pay the taxes. And they get to keep that money. Now, it's only 2 cents a day, according to Congress. When I reported, I wrote about this. I said 3 cents a day. Congress ordered a study. They said, no, that's wrong. It's 2 cents a day. Okay, a penny, 2 pennies a day. If you can get a penny a day from every person in America, you know how much money you have at the end of the year?
That adds up.
$1.1 billion. So, a billion here, a billion there, 10 billion over there. Pretty soon, people are struggling, and the narrow group of people at the top are getting richer and richer and richer, and it's government policy. How much time do you want to spend sitting around thinking about government policy? That's what the politicians are supposed to do for us.
Exactly.
And the Democrats have from time to time, and principled Republicans, especially on tax, have picked up things I've written and run with them. But they do it for a little bit and then they go away, because the campaign contributions, of course, come from the people who are getting rich by picking your pocket a penny or a dime or a dollar a day.
Yeah, there are a few things that scream reform more than what you just talked about, more than I spoke earlier about, people, Republican senators, people like Joe Manchin, who get so much money from the fossil fuel industry, who will never enact legislation that will actually help people and help the planet, because they don't want to go against their overlords. And then, of course, the issue of corporations choosing not to leave Russia because it's would be bad for their bottom line.
Yeah, that is an astonishing thing. I did not realize there were 33 companies that have not walked away. I think that will turn out to be a serious policy mistake. By the way, there's a relatively easy and I believe constitutional way to stop this influence of money.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Because I think
if you're running for Congress in a district or senator statewide, you can only receive campaign contributions from constituents in your jurisdiction. Why should Silicon Valley people in California, where I grew up, be donating to the campaigns of people running for Congress where I live in Rochester and the Finger Lakes region of New York? They shouldn't. And I've interviewed, back when I was at the New York Times, over the 13 years I was there, I asked more than 100 senators and members of Congress about fundraising. And every one of them hated it. It was humiliating. Right. It was debasing. And I'd say, well, what about fundamental reform? They're risk averse. No. They know this system. They don't want to risk another system. But if we simply said, you can only receive campaign contributions from someone who lives in the jurisdiction that you want to represent, it would have a dramatically different effect on who gets elected to Congress. And we need to stop the dark money business. And the Supreme Court will never allow this under this Supreme Court. Right. But there's a way to solve that. All state governments, legislatures have to do is say, we're giving you your corporate charter. Corporations are creatures of the government. They're created by license. They have no right to exist, unlike you and me in this audience.
Right.
And you simply put in the rules, you may not make campaign contributions. You may not reimburse executives for campaign contributions. And you won't completely eliminate their influence, but you'll radically reduce it, because what happens now is if you are a member of Congress or a senator, your constituency isn't the voters.
No.
It's the donors. It's what a term now widely used in our society that I coined a long time ago, the political donor class, or some people just call it the donor class. And that's who makes these decisions. And that's not democracy. That's corpocracy.
Exactly. And as we're seeing now in a 50-50 split Senate, that allegedly the Democrats have the majority because of Vice President Harris, the needs of the voters are not being met by any stretch of the imagination, because only 96% of the ruling party is on the same page. It's absurd. I mean, let's not even get into the fact that 50% of the Democratic senators represent 40 more million people, and the Electoral College.
Well, yeah, the Senate is inherently undemocratic. It is state land area based, not population based.
Yes.
And I suppose we could address that if we did a couple of things. California could divide into two states, not north and south. The natural divide, and I say this as someone who grew up there and lived there for 36 years, it's east-west. You should have coastal California and inland California. We could do the same thing with, and Texas could decide to do that. I mean, but we need to somehow address this inherent anti-democratic problem. The Senate was intended by the framers to be a brake on rapid and uncertain change, but this is much worse than a brake on rapid and uncertain change.
Yeah, I think it was just very short-sighted of them, because, how would they know?
Sure. How could they predict where things were going? Nobody could. Nobody.
Exactly.
Just as one of the things I teach my students in my course on regulation is back when Leonardo da Vinci did drawings indicating he understood how you could build an airplane, or at least a glider, no one gave a moment's thought to the need for air traffic control and aviation law. Even when we learned how to shoot electricity through a kind of rock called bauxite and make alumina, which eventually becomes aluminum, and build these aluminum tubes, and then to take the residue from ancient forests and turn it into jet fuel and take the tubes and push them through the air, nobody could have thought of that 500 years ago. In fact, nobody could have thought of that 120 years ago.
Right.
The law always follows experience. Well, we've got really troubling experience now that our democracy is much less safe than we imagined, because nobody imagined that you would have a madman like Donald, a know-nothing, absolute know-nothing like Donald, who is deeply mentally ill, in the White House. And our worst presidents, Andrew Jackson, whose image hung in Donald's Oval Office, he at least tried to do what he thought was best for the country. I mean, the man was a murderous, racist slaveholder, but he didn't say, oh, this is my chance to get stuff for me. It was, this is my chance to make the country better. Chester Arthur, same thing, came out of Tammany Hall, became an honest man in the White House. And, what happens if we get Donald in the form of someone else who has all of his instincts and all of his charisma, but is a competent manager, a hard worker, and understands how government works? Well, kiss your liberties goodbye.
Right. Well, and in the context of a Republican Party that's totally cool with it, which, by the way, I don't think most people thought 5 years ago or 6 years ago.
Mary, I'm Donald's age, so I'm older than you. In the 1960s, if a high school or junior high school teacher had said to me, the day will come when Republican leaders will denounce American intelligence agencies, they will say they trust the leader in the Kremlin, I would have gone right to the principal's office and said, you need to get somebody with butterfly nets, because we got a teacher who's off the rails crazy. But that's what we're seeing. The people who brought us McCarthyism and Richard Nixon's investigations, and claims that Hollywood was overrun with communists, is now the party that is, up until the Ukraine attack, with Putin. Tucker Carlson, the #1 talk show host on television, literally, I call him Tucker, quote, "I'm rooting for Russia," close quote, Carlson. Now he's trying to back away from that.
Yeah.
But this is very scary stuff.
And David, let's be clear. It's very obvious, and I hope more than I can possibly say that this does not happen. But if Donald is allowed to get back in, and he would have to be allowed, right? This is not something that he can do on his own. If he's allowed to run, if he's allowed to get back in, the Republican Party en masse will be pro-Putin again. And who knows what Russia will have done in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with all the people who call themselves patriots and then speak well of Vladimir Putin is what they really believe in is democracy for me and people who look like me or believe like me. No, democracy is for everybody. I have, in a lot of my career, defended people I thought in articles that were just horrible, but that's not the point. If you're not defending everyone's right, you're not defending anyone's right. And then layer onto this, Antonin Scalia's crazy, I don't know any other word to put on it, interpretation of the Second Amendment and all of the Second Amendment absolutists.
Yep.
In fact, one of the little jokes I make it clear, I'm making a joke to my students, is I say, the Second Amendment doesn't refer to guns, it talks about arms. Well, a nuclear weapon is an arm. We now have nuclear weapons that you can literally fit in a backpack. I mean, heavy, it's going to weigh 50 pounds, but we can build a nuclear weapon. We have built them that will fit in a backpack. So if we're going to be absolutists, I want a personal nuclear weapon because nobody's going to mess with me. And of course, it's illegal to have a nuclear weapon. We, of course, have limits on guns. You can't buy a howitzer and park it in your lawn.
Yet.
And yet we allow these killing machines, the semi-automatic, or as I prefer to call them, rapid fire rifles and pistols. And we see slaughter after slaughter after slaughter. And people say, oh, no, we can't have any controls because of the Second Amendment. We have all sorts of limits on things. The First Amendment isn't unlimited.
Nope.
If you want to revive the Aztec religion, you are absolutely free to do so. But the moment you put the virgin on the slab, or the altar, and raise your knife, just raising your knife, that's a crime. We arrest you, you go to prison. You actually carry through with it, we put you in prison.
That's right.
And we have lots of limits like that. No right is absolute, and the Constitution, as one of our Supreme Court justices said, is not a suicide pact.
Yeah, but your point about the Second Amendment is very well taken, and I think it explains in part, because this is something I've really been trying to figure out, the kind of loss of importance of human life. In fact, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, a scholar of authoritarianism, said that to me. Because I was like, why does people not seem to care that they're dying, that they're putting their children in danger? We're talking about COVID. And she sort of traced it back to the unfettered Second Amendment, the unfettered ability to own any kind of weapon you want, generally speaking, of the kind of weapons people have access to, not nuclear weapons, but rapid fire, that the kinds of weapons you don't use to go hunting because they will destroy the animal you're killing, right?
There's a foundational problem there, and that is my parents were non-believers, but I was required to go to a whole bunch of different Sunday schools and Catholic Mass and synagogue, etc., because my parents said you need to understand all of this to operate in the world. Same approach I took with my 8 children. And if you get religious training, you learn about the sanctity of human life. Doesn't mean everybody gets the message, but you certainly get drilled into your head the sanctity of human life. And that's, every semester I ask my new students about their background. How many of you, went to Sunday school or shul or catechism? Almost nobody, just nobody. And so they don't have any grounding in moral values. And Syracuse is, it's not the very best schools in America, but it's not, middle of nowhere Texas junior college. It's a serious top flight school. And I'm floored by this. And when I go lecture at other colleges, I sometimes ask these questions. And the same thing. We're not teaching fundamentally the sanctity of human life, except in the context of abortion, where that's just a political discussion that has nothing to do with reality, and really distorts people's thinking.
But it seems to me that the worst purveyors of the seeming lack of concern for the so-called sanctity of human life are white evangelicals.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
Right?
Because they're not fundamentally, having jousted with many of them on call-in radio and whatnot. I constantly encounter people who call themselves Christians and they're faux Christians.
Right.
And Donald is sort of the perfect example of that. In his book, Think Big, he spends 6 pages denouncing Christians as fools, idiots, and schmucks. And he means that last word in the most vile Yiddish sense.
Yes, he does.
And he says, my life philosophy is one word: revenge. Well, you cannot be a Christian and believe in revenge. If there's anything else about Christianity, you cannot believe in revenge and call yourself a Christian.
Right.
And he said this as recently as the National Prayer Breakfast, his last year in office, where one of the speakers, I think it was Andy Biggs from the American Enterprise Institute, who's a religious man, said, we need to forgive people. And Donald got up and said, I can't do that. I can't do that. And so, if Jesus came back to life to America, if you think that he was tough on the money changers in the temple, he just, go, all of these people, who are you? You don't have no idea what I came and I wrote, or people say I said. You have no idea whatsoever.
Yeah. And that's actually a really good segue. I always end the show with 2 questions, but before we get to that, I've been wanting to talk to you about this other thing, and revenge is the word. And this is personal. Before the 2016 election, you wrote about this in your book, and you're the only person I saw speaking about it, is what Donald and his siblings did after my brother and I sued my grandfather's estate. Our family health insurance, which all of us had since we were born, was canceled, and whatever, I'll be fine. But I had a newborn nephew who was in the neonatal intensive care unit for months, who really needed that health insurance
very much.
So the question is, you can say we're a pretty misogynistic country. People think that it makes Donald a more appealing candidate to certain people and a tougher, cooler guy if he's sexually harassing women with impunity.
And some women think that.
Yeah, some women, plenty of women, most white women, or the majority of white women. People could say that, he had every right to screw me over because, as in his words, I disrespected his father, which I didn't do because his father was dead when all of this was going down. However, we're talking about a baby. We're talking about other things he's done that you would think would cross a line for anybody. So one question is, why didn't stories like that, which should have, that more than anything else, should have torpedoed his candidacy? Why didn't it get traction, and why didn't anybody seem to care?
Well, it didn't get traction because the story was originally broken by a really good reporter, Heidi Evans, who was a colleague of mine at the LA Times back in the 70s and the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And it would require, a lot of legwork to go and do that story. Most journalism is an absolutely accurate, reliable account of the official version of events yesterday. The White House made a statement. Company X announced the profits or a new product. An airplane fell out of the sky. But there's relatively little coverage that is enterprise, where you do it on your own. Mm-hmm. And in this case, where your brother has a baby born who has serious health problems right out of the womb and lifelong expenses, and Donald cancels the insurance because the two of you are challenging the way that the money that would have gone to your father, Fred Jr., was reduced to virtually nothing. And the money was divided up by the other four siblings. Now, we have in New York, as everybody who watches Law and Order knows, something called a depraved indifference statute. What Donald did by canceling the insurance to gain leverage over money wasn't depraved indifference. It was depraved, period. He literally was prepared to kill a child for money. That goes right to the heart of his character. One of the things he benefited from, however, was the document that every significant news producer and editor, that is decider of what's going to be news in this country, reads every day is the New York Times, as they should. The editors of the Times during the campaign, the politics editor was someone who didn't have the chops to do the job, was totally unqualified for that job. Don't know how that came about, but it was a mistake. I mean, corporate companies make mistakes. They put the wrong people in the wrong job.
Right.
And the Times editors had this view that everybody in New York knows that Donald's a crook and a terrible human being. And when I went back to some of my editors of the Times and said, "You're missing what's going on here," they would say, "Everybody knows that." And I'd say, "Yeah, but people in Keokuk, Iowa and East Texas think he is a living God."
Right.
You know, you need to think about the country and what other people think. And so the arrogance of particularly the Times, but the rest of the news media as well, was significant in this. And Hillary Clinton didn't make an issue out of it. She should have really run with it. She didn't. I mean, she was, after all, if she'd been elected, I'm absolutely persuaded that her focus would have been on children. Her whole life record was about especially disadvantaged children of all races. So it's also difficult for most journalists to get away from what they're told is the news. I don't have any trouble with this because I didn't go to journalism school. When I was a teenager, I was in high school, I was married, I had a kid on the way, and I became a reporter. And so when they would hand out a press release, the local daily would just rewrite. I would look at the budget material in it, and I would do long division, and I would explain it in terms that made sense to people because I didn't know any better. But journalists are trained, you never get in trouble for just telling the official version of events. Well, the official version of events isn't the truth. It's the official version of the events. And you need to get at the unofficial version of events as well. What are the facts that the official version doesn't cover or hide? And most journalists just do not do that, no matter how good they are. It's not in the way they approach their job.
Yeah, and here we are.
Yeah. So you have two questions, you said?
Yes. First of all, thank you so much. I know we're going a little long, but this has been fascinating. But, you know, things are tough. There's a lot of horrible things going on, and you're mired in it. So I'd like to know, and other people would like to know, what gives you hope in these relatively dark times, and how do you hang on to it?
Well, we have survived transitioning from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy to a digital economy, and we are on the cusp of the genetic economy that will change the world far more than any of these previous changes. We survived the British sacking the White House and burning it. We survived Andrew Jackson. We survived a civil war in which 2.5% of, I think that's right, massive deaths during the Civil War. We only had 30 million people. Yeah, 2.5% of Americans died in the Civil War. And by the way, about somewhere around 15% of those who died were Black Americans.
That's right.
Many of them as soldiers. You know, we survived thing after horrible event, after mistaken policy, and we're still here. So we're inherently a resilient society. We're an idea. We're not a hereditary kingdom like the Emirates or Saudi Arabia. We are an idea, and we've proven flexible to that. I worry that the rapid pace of change, which is going to continue to accelerate long into the future.
Yeah.
Many people can't cope with. I mean, that's why I think we're seeing fundamentalist Muslims, Jews, Christians, Buddhists, Hinduists all around the world. It's like, no, I want to go back to what I had. It doesn't exist anymore, and it never did. There was never a white picket fence America. That was television.
Right.
People say, oh, there'll never be more a newspaper reporter as good as so-and-so. Nonsense. There are young people coming along all the time who want to do it, and most of them will be so-so, and a few of them will really matter. Same thing with politics, law, medical research, new inventions. I never thought I was in the business of solving problems. I was in the business of revealing problems and seeing if people want to deal with them, but they are essentially problems you manage. Or as a head of a Boys and Girls Club told me years ago when I was writing about the decline of United Way for a big front page New York Times Sunday article. He said, United Way's slogan right now is "We solve problems." He said, I don't solve problems. I'm in the business of getting kids who are 10 years old to 18 years old without getting arrested. And so long as there are new 10-year-olds, there will be boys and girls who we need to get to 18 without ruining their lives. It's a process. It's something we manage. So fundamentally, the world is the way it is, but it over time gets better. We're far less violent than we were 100 years ago. In fact, we're far less violent than we were 40 and 30 years ago. But of course, then there's the Monty Python line about there's progress, but then the Dark Ages came.
Touche.
Now, so what's the other one?
Just how do you hang on to it? And I think you answered it, because
you just, what else are you going to do? You're just going to, oh my goodness, it's all falling apart. I'm going to sit down and cry.
Some people are.
That's not going to get you anywhere.
No.
You do what you can do and try to make the world a better place. And that includes calling out people who benefit by making it a worse place. And there's a lot of work we have done to create a more perfect union. But, our Constitution, in my view, and the way I teach it is, our Constitution is premised on the notion that if you ennoble the human spirit and provide an ordered system of liberty, we will see how far our species can go. You cannot go in a dictatorship, in a theocracy, the way you can if you give people the maximum amount of freedom that's consistent with order. And that should be our focus. What can we become, no matter what our travails are now? And in all of my books on Donald, in Temples of Chance, my 1992 book that's about 40% about Donald and the casino business, and then in The Making of Donald Trump, it's even worse than you think. And the new book, The Big Cheat, what I'm trying to do is get people to understand that these aren't just random events that come from nowhere. They have context and meaning. And if you read them, lots of things will make sense to you. And that grows out of the theory which I used to teach my students and that has motivated my career since I was in graduate school and a professor dressed me down for an answer I gave. If you learn things at the level of principle and theory, the mechanics will be obvious and you will see things other people don't see and understand how the world works.
Beautifully said. And I hope we will start teaching our children that from a very young age, because I think it would change a lot. David Cay Johnston, thank you again. This has been fantastic. Your work is invaluable. It has helped me keep things in perspective and understand things that I didn't necessarily have an insight into, even though he's my uncle. So keep up the amazing work. And I know so many appreciate what you're doing. So thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Mary. Appreciate your having me on.
All right. Stay safe.
Take care.
I am ready to answer some of your questions. I love this part. It's great to hear from you guys. So if you do have anything you want to ask me next week, you can send your questions to mary@politicon.com, and I'll get to as many of your questions as I can. So first up, we have from Kathleen in Simi Valley, California. Do you think Trumpsters, Republicans, really believe that their politicians are not involved with Russia and the dark money coming from there, or is it acceptable to them as long as it keeps them in power? I'm not really sure. I think that they'll believe whatever they're told, even if it contradicts something they've been told 5 seconds earlier. I mean, we see this all the time. Donald says one thing and then he completely contradicts himself, and then he contradicts himself again. And he says 3 versions of what his truth, and there doesn't need to be any logical consistency, and people will just keep up and believe whatever he's saying in the moment. But I think the bottom line is, at this point, this party and the people continuing to vote for Republicans only care that the party stays in power. Doesn't matter how, doesn't matter where the money's coming from. And it doesn't matter what they have to do to keep it. So sadly, I think that is the case. From Kate in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, will we ever see an atheist elected to public office, let alone the Supreme Court? It seems we have to believe in some God, but so many seem like they're just pretending. Yeah, it's quite something that for a country that allegedly has a separation between church and state, the need to be religious has become more and more explicit. I mean, it's been implicit for a long time, but it's becoming explicit. And by religious, I mean, generally speaking, some kind of Christian or Protestant, really. So I think it's unlikely. It depends on the office, but president, no, I don't think there's any way that an atheist could successfully run for president. I hope I'm wrong, because I think generally speaking, we know that atheists are more open-minded and less judgmental about things like religion, or the different religions, than people who are certainly on the more fundamentalist end of the spectrum. So yeah, it seems to be a litmus test now, and that goes against, I think, what the founders had in mind, and that's a shame. And just to add really quickly, because part of what's happening now on the right is this trend towards trying to convince people that America is a Christian country. America is not a Christian country. But that is a very dangerous belief that's taking hold in certain segments of the population, which may not end well if we don't figure out how to diffuse that. From Tanny in Austin, Texas. I agree with Eugene from last week. We need loud Democrats resisting. I think we need a Live Aid or a comic relief with a march. Where the hell is rock and roll? Some of those people are multimillionaires, and it's time to give back. Think it will ever happen? I think a lot of the kinds of protests or events that we might have seen, given the deep hatred of Donald on the left and the terror he inspired if he were to have gotten a second term, were put on hold because of COVID. COVID put Democrats at a disadvantage in a way it didn't put Republicans. Like, for example, Democrats weren't going door to door before the elections because of COVID. Democrats were very conscious of not doing anything or having any kinds of events that would get people sick or kill them, whereas Republicans didn't care. I mean, we saw that with the rallies, so Republicans had a better ground game. They had more in-person events because they were perfectly willing to risk the lives of their supporters, which I still can't quite wrap my head around. I think things will be very different this time around, assuming that we finally do get a complete handle on COVID, which we haven't quite done yet. I really would like to see some massive events in advance of the 2022 midterms, because you guys are going to get sick of my saying this, but I think that we cannot overstate how important those elections are. I mean, we really, really, really can. From Mrs. Strong, would you support laws being changed to require presidential campaign nominees to take the same mental and psych evaluations as generals in the military and make them prove they're stable enough to command troops and handle nuclear weapons? Yeah, I would absolutely support it, but I don't think it's something that can be done. I think it's something that would have to be handled by the parties. And, the Republicans could have gotten rid of Donald in 30 seconds if they had just demanded that their candidates show their tax returns. And they weren't even willing to do that. So I don't have a lot of hope that can happen. But again, as always, the solution to a lot of these problems is to elect as many Democrats as possible. And then maybe we can affect some real change in how elections are structured and how government is structured and how the Constitution can finally become a document that gives us an actual democracy in which all of us are equally represented. That is it for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us for our second live broadcast. And thank you to David Cay Johnston. It was such a pleasure to have him here. I've been wanting to ask him questions for a very long time, so it was great to hear what he had to say. Please come every Thursday, 7:00 p.m. Eastern time, 4:00 Pacific time. Sorry, I always forget that part because I'm from New York, and Eastern time is the only time in which I think. We're at the Politicon YouTube channel, so I would really appreciate it if you liked us, subscribed, and click the bell. Because if you click the bell on YouTube, you will be alerted every time a new episode is upcoming. So again, subscribe to the Politicon channel, and click on that bell so you get alerted to new episodes. Also, follow us on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts, except, of course, Spotify. And give us a 5-star review because it really does help people find the show. Again, if you have any questions for me, you can send an email to mary@politicon.com, and I will get to as many of your questions as I can. Thank you again for being here. It was such a great show with David Cay Johnston. I look forward to seeing you next week. Same place, same time. And in the meantime, stay safe.